Good evening and welcome to Baldwin Wallace University and the Center for Innovation and Growth. My name is Linda Bluso and I'm chair of the Business Division at BW. Thank you for joining us tonight for what I believe will be a dynamic and compelling discussion about the global, European, U.S., and Northeast Ohio economic outlooks for 2013 and beyond. This event is being jointly sponsored by the Baldwin Wallace Business Division and the MBA Association, comprised of current MBA students and BW MBA alumni. First, I want to give a few thank yous out there and shout outs. I want to thank the Business Division staff for all their help in making this happen. Kathy Hayden, who's in the back there with the black and white jacket and red. Is that a vest? I can't see that far. I apologize. Thank you, Kathy. She just makes moves mountains for us. Lisa Judd, who is with the Alumni Association, I want to shout out. Kim Devney, who runs this Center for Innovation and Growth on all the events and making sure that the furniture gets moved and the tables get set and all those great things. I also want to thank Dr. Judy Krutke, who is in the International Studies and Political Science departments at BW, who really was instrumental in bringing this idea to the Business Division. For that, I'm very grateful because I think that this is going to be a very exciting night and a night for us to all learn something that we don't know, haven't known before. I want to also thank the trustees that are here tonight and the members of the Business Advisory Council for being in attendance at this event. So tonight, we are fortunate to have an outstanding panel to address our topic, and I have the pleasure to introduce the panel to you now. Michael Whitekall, a 1994 graduate of Baldwin Wallace, is the Executive Director of ISA International Strategic Analysis, a world leader in country intelligence, economic forecasting, and international business advisory services. He has a leadership role in analyzing international opportunities for companies and organizations to expand their activities into new markets. Mr. Whitekall is an expert in the fields of international affairs, demographics, and market analysis. He is frequently a speaker at international conferences, having spoken at events in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, South Africa, Spain, the Czech Republic, and various other countries in recent years. Welcome back, Michael. Dr. Kevin Jakes is the Boynton D. Murch Chair in Finance at Baldwin Wallace. Prior to joining the BW faculty in 2005, Dr. Jakes spent 14 years as an economist with the U.S. Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., advising Treasury officials and members of the George W. Bush administration on the U.S. financial and banking system. A nationally recognized expert on government policy and finance, Dr. Jakes has advised representatives of China, Japan, and the European Union on matters of international banking and U.S. regulatory policy, and his economic and financial commentaries have received hundreds of media citations. Welcome, Kevin. Tom Waltermeyer is the CEO of Team Northeast Ohio, commonly referred to as Team NEO, the region's private sector economic development hub. Team NEO facilitates our region's economic competitiveness strategy and markets the Northeast Ohio region globally. Tom joined Team NEO following a 31-year career with major Northeast Ohio corporations, including B.F. Goodrich, the Geon Company, and PolyOne Corporation, where he served as CEO of both organizations. Tom serves on the Board of Trustees at Baldwin Wallace and also serves or has served on the executive committees and boards of Cleveland Tomorrow, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, Jumpstart, the Ohio Business Roundtable, the Ohio Polymer Strategy Council, and Ohio's Third Frontier Advisory Board. Welcome, Tom. Harvey Hobson is the director of the International MBA program at BW and will moderate the question and answer session tonight. Harvey is a graduate of BW and earned his law degree from Cleveland State University. He served for 26 years in the United States Marine Corps in various capacities, including prosecutor, chief defense counsel, head of the legal department at the Naval Academy, head of the research division with the Pentagon, and general court-martial circuit judge for the Western Pacific region. Additionally, Harvey has taught executive seminars in 19 different countries in a program operated by the U.S. State Department. Welcome, Harvey. Here's the format for tonight. Michael, Kevin, and Tom will each now speak for approximately 10 minutes each regarding their topic. Michael will offer his insights on the global and Europe economies and trade opportunities across the European Union. Then Kevin will provide views and expectations on the U.S. economy, and Tom will discuss the Northeast Ohio economic perspectives and how these global trends and opportunities can be leveraged in ways to benefit Northeast Ohio. After these short presentations, we will open it up for approximately a 30-minute question and answer session moderated by Harvey. With that, Michael, we'd be interested in hearing your assessment of the global and European economic scenarios.
Okay. Oh, good evening, everyone. I trust you can hear me okay. I'm very happy to be back here at BW. As mentioned, I graduated from here in 1994, and it's quite an honor to be back in this beautiful new building. My job tonight is to talk about the global economic outlook. We're going to talk about the U.S. and local a little bit later. So what I want to do is really take this in 3 steps. I want to have a look back at the past year. What happened in 2012, and how is that going to influence what's going to happen in 2013 and beyond for the global economy? Then we're going to look at 2013. What should we be looking for this year from an economic perspective, from a political perspective? Then we're going to look at a few longer-term issues and trends globally and how they could impact Northeast Ohio. So let's look back 2012. It was quite a mixed year for the global economy. I'm not going to dwell on the United States because we're going to hear that later, but it is a year of tentative recovery here. Of course, I live in Europe at the moment. There's a big crisis going on at the moment. 2012 was the year where that crisis shifted from a debt and currency crisis to what's now a growth crisis. Europe, the recession in Southern Europe deepened in 2012, whereas Northern Europe, which had thus far done relatively well thanks to its ability to export outside of Europe, is starting to falter as well. 2012 was also the year where China and India proved vulnerable to global factors. China's economic growth slowed to below 8% last year. India's growth slowed to just around 5%, a little bit more last year, showing that the world's 2 giant emerging markets are also susceptible to weakness. We've seen some major mid-sized emerging markets start to emerge on the scene in 2012. Economies like Indonesia, the Philippines, which had struggled due to political instability, a lack of economic development, they're starting to grow at a much more rapid pace and are offering exporters here in Northeast Ohio and elsewhere major opportunities for growth. In contrast, some mid-sized emerging markets which had performed well, such as Turkey, Vietnam, and Brazil, ran into difficulties in 2012. And that's had an impact on some businesses here in Northeast Ohio. One major issue in 2012, which is impacting Baldwin Wallace students directly, is the global employment crisis. Youth unemployment rates around the world are at record levels. In Spain and Greece, the youth unemployment rate is at 56%. Places like Italy, it's about 38%. Even here in the United States, it's 15.6%. It's very difficult for many people around the world, young people particularly, to find work at the moment. And this is something that could persist even as the global economy starts to recover in 2013 and beyond. Despite the troubles in 2012, global trade continues to expand. We estimate that it grew by around 5% in 2012. That's not a great level, but it's a better level than the global economy as a whole. Last year, one thing I'd like to talk about the politics in 2012. 2012 was an unprecedented year for elections and leadership changes. There were elections and leadership changes in countries that account for almost 2/3 of the world's economy. This hasn't happened since 1945 at the end of World War II, when many governments were forced from office, when Franklin Roosevelt passed away. So in the last 6 decades, there has never been, well, more than 6 decades, a series of major national elections and leadership changes, as there was in 2012. A couple other political issues that have emerged over the past few months. Tensions in East Asia are rising, and the seas off of China. This is a major issue to pay attention to because it involves some of our largest trading partners and some of the fastest growing economies in the world. In 2012, the Arab Spring became the Arab Winter. We have civil wars in Syria and Yemen. We had a civil war in Libya, which ended just before 2012. We have unrest in countries such as Bahrain. This has had a major impact on global stability in one of the most unstable regions in the world. That's just a quick look back at 2012. What does that mean for 2013? Again, I'm not going to touch too much on the US, but we do expect a recovery to eventually take shape despite the bad news that came out today about the fourth quarter. Europe, our largest trading partner outside of North America, will remain in a recession in 2013. Countries such as Italy, Spain, Greece are going to remain in a deep recession, and even economies like France and Germany are going to struggle to record any growth in 2013. This is because austerity measures have really damaged the domestic markets in the region, as have demographic changes, and the euro is appreciating. The euro is getting stronger. This is really damaging export prospects for Europe at a time when they need to export more than ever. China, we look for China to bounce back to what is the new normal. The double-digit growth levels in China probably are at an end, but we're looking at growth rates of about 8 or 9% in 2013 and the years beyond in China. For most countries, that would be an exemplary performance. For China, they'll be well below the performance of the past 2 decades. India, the other giant emerging market, we forecast to continue to struggle. Political instability within the country, the inability to pass economic reforms will hinder economic growth in India, and that will hinder opportunities for US firms there. New growth markets will continue to arise in emerging markets. As I mentioned earlier, countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines are providing major new opportunities for growth. And one region to really take a look at is sub-Saharan Africa, a region which is recording excellent economic growth rates in countries where new oil and gas discoveries have made, in countries where the infrastructure is being expanded. Major opportunities for US companies are forthcoming in that region. Politically, 2013 is not going to be the year of the election and leadership changes that we saw last year. Nevertheless, we'll see in China the new leadership fully take power this year. That could have major implications for the most important bilateral relationship in the world, that of the United States and China. The Middle East and North Africa remains very volatile. We have the civil war ongoing in Syria. We have Egypt potentially collapsing. We have the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians fraught with danger. So that bears watching very closely. Also Iran, 2013 is probably the make or break year for Iran. First, you have the nuclear program. They're going to be getting closer and closer to the capability of producing nuclear weapons. Does that mean Israel or the United States is going to launch an attack on Iran? And if they do, what are the implications for the global economy? Of course, in Iran, you also have a collapsing economy. The sanctions are having a major impact there. That's also having a major impact. And there's going to be a presidential election this year, and Mr. Ahmadinejad is not allowed to run for another term in office, so there will be a new president of Iran. And 2 elections to watch, if you're looking at, if you're an election watcher internationally, both of them in Europe, Italy and Germany. And both of those elections will have a major impact on that region's ability to deal with the crisis which is ongoing at the moment. That's 2013. What are a few longer-term trends that you as Northeast Ohioans, as businessmen or students, businesswomen, need to pay attention to? In the developing world, long-term stagnation in what we call the old world. The demographic decline in Europe and Japan will accelerate. The working age population and the purchasing age population in those 2 regions is declining. This is making both of those regions ever more dependent upon export growth, but it is becoming increasingly difficult to export with this tremendous amount of global competition. At the same time, export competitiveness levels in many areas of Europe and in Japan have been waning as well. And this is having a major impact on their economies, and this is the root of the crisis which is ongoing in Europe. In the new world, if you will, in the United States, Canada, Australia, population growth should continue. It has slowed slightly, but it should continue. This will allow the domestic markets in the new world economies to continue to grow as opposed to the old world, and this will allow for higher rates of economic growth, in our view, in the new world as opposed to the old world. As far as the trends in the emerging markets which need to be looked at, China's growth potential is real. China's power potential is real. China is a major power in nearly all forms of power, whether it be demographic, economically, militarily. China has the ability to project power at increasing levels sooner, and this will have major implications for our relations with China and in many areas of the world, such as East Asia, the Indian Ocean, and Africa. In contrast, India's internal challenges are likely to hinder growth over the longer term, and this will have a major impact on a country which will soon have 1.7 billion people. By the year 2050, that's not so soon, we'll have 1.7 billion people living in India, making it the most populous country in the world, which is generally bereft of natural resources. This is a major risk factor for the region and for the world. New giants such as Brazil and Indonesia continue to emerge and will play an ever larger role in the global economy. And of course, the key is who can emulate the success of the East Asian economies, such as South Korea, Japan, countries that were once much poorer, were able to export around the world and develop wealthy economies. Which countries will win that battle to do the same? That will be the key in the longer term. So what does this mean for Ohio? It means Ohio faces more international competition than ever before. Just when I was studying here at BW, the communism had just fallen. The East Asian giants such as China and India were just integrating into the global economy. That meant a huge influx of workers, a huge influx of potential consumers, and also meant a huge influx of potential competitors for Northeast Ohio. Of course, also means major opportunities for Northeast Ohio. Ohio exports have doubled over the past decade and will continue to grow at a rapid pace, will continue to become an ever larger share of the Ohio economy, meaning we are ever more tied in to the global economy here in Ohio. In 1999, for example, 60% of Ohio's exports went to Canada and Mexico. Today that figure is around 50% and will continue to decline. The same holds true for Europe. Ohio companies are ever more active in emerging markets in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East. Fortunately for Ohio, we don't have too much exposure to the Eurozone crisis. That's good news. We don't have too much exposure to Japan. These two markets, which I mentioned, are going to stagnate over the longer term. The growth markets, in turn, will be in Asia and Latin America. Those will also be the growth markets for Northeast Ohio. I think I've taken my 10 minutes on a quick tour of the world. If you have any questions later, by all means, don't hesitate to ask me. And also, one last thing. This is part of what is usually a much longer presentation I do. If you'd like a copy of that presentation, give me your business card after the conference is over, and I'll be happy to send it to you in the next couple of days via email. Thank you.
Kevin. That leaves me up, thank you very much, so I can talk about the national economy. You know, Linda asked me if I would be on this panel, and it's wonderful to be on panel where with new people I haven't met, get different perspectives that I don't have. But when Linda asked me, she gave me 2 months to plan on what I was going to say, and I thought, oh my gosh, maybe you can take the regulator out of Washington or the policy advisor out of Washington, but I don't know, maybe it never leaves you. So I'm sitting there saying 2 months, my gosh, I'm used to 2 minutes to figure out what I'm going to say. And now I've got 2 whole months and I'm confused and I'm thinking, how am I going to approach this? And I mentioned this to my wife, and I said, you know, if I was at the Treasury and this was President Bush's people, we would have looked through it and then it dawned on me. I said, wait a minute. The way I'll talk to the audience tonight for my 10 minutes is simply to give you the view that the policymakers at the Treasury Department and in the other agencies that I had the chance to work with in Washington, how they would view the current economy. And so let's just simply look through that prism as they would look through. And if you look at it that way, there are 5 key economic variables that your Washington, D.C. policymakers look through. Here's what they're looking at. 1, they're looking at the growth of the economy. How rapidly is the economy growing? 2, they're looking at unemployment or the unemployment rate. To what degree are people unemployed? To what degree are we creating jobs? To what degree are there people who just gave up looking for jobs? 3, if we sat around talking about this, the third variable we would think of is inflation. What's happening to the price level? No great surprises here. And then the 4th variable would be a whole host of international considerations. Everything from the trade balance to the exchange rate of the dollar versus any one of a number of foreign currencies. The one that often surprises people that policymakers spend a whole lot of time talking about is financial market stability. How stable are our financial markets? How efficiently are they functioning? So let's just take a quick look at those. If I look at economic growth, in the third, I was all prepared to say, hey, things are looking a whole lot better because in the third quarter of this year, 2012, the economy went up by 2.5% to 3%. The latest revised number is about 3.1, which is about average economic growth for this country. So then as I'm doing that, I'm perusing the news services today, and if you saw the numbers, the preliminary numbers came out, and in the 4th quarter of 2012, the economy contracted by 0.1%. It was a move in the wrong direction. We'll come back to that. Second, unemployment. During the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, the unemployment rate peaked at 10%. It is now down to 7.8%, but we're more than 2 years past the end of the recession. So this is by no means robust post-economic growth in terms of job creation. To make matters worse, this economy is currently only generating on the order of about 130,000 to 150,000 jobs a month. If you were to look at the number of jobs that were lost during the 18 months that made up the financial crisis, it's on the order of about 5 million. So you've got to divide 150,000 into 5 million a whole lot of times before you make up for just the jobs that were lost. And that doesn't even count new graduates or others that are entering the workforce. How about inflation? Well, on inflation, we have some good news, and that's necessary. It's actually absolutely necessary. Inflation is running at about 1.7%. That's below its historic average of about 3%. And much of the policy that we see coming out of Washington, D.C. today, particularly the policy coming out of the Federal Reserve, requires that inflation rate stays relatively low. If that inflation rate starts to spike up and it gets above 2 or 3%, then the policy decisions out of D.C. are going to become a whole lot more complicated, and this puzzle is going to be a whole lot trickier. Trade balance, I'll simply mention the trade balance. We are running, the United States, we're running about a $600 billion trade balance with the rest of the world. That's not a good number, but it's not as bad as it otherwise had been. And then finally, financial market stability. If we're going to talk about this, I say this to my students sometimes. I'm not exactly sure what financial market stability is. It's hard to define. But what I do know is, what we oftentimes do is we know when we see unstable financial markets, as we saw during the financial crisis. Our financial markets simply stop functioning correctly, which makes it hard to get loans. The stock market takes enormous hits. A variety of things occur. One of the nice things that has happened in recent time periods is financial market stability, or the stress, maybe a better way to say it is, the stress on financial markets is at or near the lowest level it has been since before the financial crisis. So it's a very comforting point, because one of the things that happened in the 2007-2009 financial crisis is policymakers in D.C. spent an inordinate amount of time worried about the financial stability with less emphasis upon some of the other issues. All right, so the next thing we would have done at Treasury in talking to the bosses is we would have said, okay, here's the things we want to pay attention to where we can be optimistic. Here's the things we want to pay attention to where we're more pessimistic. On the optimistic side, there is actually some very good news here. The stock market, if you haven't been paying attention, your 401k has, your IRA has, the stock market is at or near 5-year highs. Housing wealth. Housing prices have been increasing. During the financial crisis, over $7 trillion in housing wealth was wiped out. Housing prices in the last year have begun to recover. Here in the Ohio, Cleveland area, it's very modest, 1-2%?
Not much.
Something on that. If you look nationally, it's more on the order of 5 to 10%, but truth be told, the vast majority of large housing markets in this country are now experiencing house price appreciation. In some cases, it's as mild as 5%. In other cases, 10%. But there are cities like Phoenix where the housing price appreciation is in excess of 20%. Why do I bring that up? Here's why. Because here's what ends up happening. There is a significant portion of consumer behavior that is driven by the health of the stock market and housing wealth. We oftentimes think of, I simply consume on the basis of what I earn. And that's true for a lot of us. But a significant portion of housing wealth and stock market wealth impact consumption. Consumption accounts for about 2/3 of economic growth in this country. So if consumers aren't spending, government can spend all it wants to, and we've seen that going on, okay? Businesses in general are going to look at that. They're going to say, wait a minute, consumers aren't spending. I don't want to spend either. And we've seen that going on. But we're starting to see signs that consumers are coming back, in part driven by the fact that their stock market wealth and their housing wealth are appreciating. So that's a reason to be optimistic. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy. The Federal Reserve continues to maintain a monetary policy of very low interest rates, and they have publicly stated they expect that to continue into 2015 and or until we get the unemployment rate down to about 6.5%. So we could be looking at a few more years of low interest rates. That generally drives down the cost of capital for businesses. And then finally, and people may bristle when I say this, but one of the really good pieces of news coming out is that bank profitability has returned to the level it was before the 2007 crisis. Now your response is, hey, wait a minute, I'm not a big fan of banks. I saw what happened, all the problems we ran into, and then all the government money that was thrown at large banks. What you have to understand, and in 2005, I served on an interagency committee where we dealt with some of these issues about large banks and the problems at large banks in a crisis. One of the things people have to understand is a healthy banking system is absolutely fundamental for our financial system to work properly. And if our financial system doesn't work properly, that then spills over into the main economy where businesses have trouble getting credit, consumers have trouble getting loans, and the economy in general contracts. All right? Banks are back to being healthy again. So that's an enormous sign of optimism, albeit when you say, hey, banks are back to the profitability we saw in 2007, people generally may bristle at you. How about the pessimistic side? Job creation. I noted earlier we lost 5 million jobs during the financial crisis. We're only creating about 130 to 150,000 jobs a year. Do that math real quick, and we are talking about years, plural, till we get back to anything reasonably approaching full employment. The fiscal cliff is still a problem. I know you thought to yourself, wait a minute, didn't we solve that on December 31st or the early days of January? And the answer is no. What we did at that time, what Congress did at that time is they implemented a tax increase for wealthy Americans. But in the process, what they also did is there is a tax increase on effectively all of us. If you have a job, you have a 2% tax increase that will show up in your first paycheck this year and will show up on every paycheck for the rest of the year, unless they make a change. There is a tax increase that is out there. That tax increase has made consumers very pessimistic going forward and has made businesses somewhat reluctant as they sit there and try to make an assessment. Third, the debt ceiling. What Congress did with the fiscal cliff is they simply took the debt ceiling. Our debt ceiling, the U.S. government's debt ceiling, is at about $16.4 trillion. All right? We bump up against the debt ceiling, and that means the U.S. Treasury can't borrow any more money until that debt ceiling gets raised. Okay? So Treasury has a couple of tricks. We had a couple of tricks. I had nothing to do with it. We had a couple of tricks we can use to put off the debt ceiling. My friend Don ran debt management. There's a couple of tricks that Treasury can do that put off that debt ceiling, violating the debt ceiling for a month or two. And it's been pushed down the road. But ultimately, the debt ceiling becomes an issue because the U.S. Treasury isn't going to be able, at some point, the tricks run out. The Treasury isn't going to be able to borrow more money, and unless Congress says, okay, we're willing to extend it. But Congress has said, we're going to extend it, but first we want to deal with a whole bunch of other issues like spending cuts in the balanced budget, and you get the political mess that we have been through on more than one occasion. The U.S. Treasury Department has never defaulted on a security in over 200 years. All right? So the risk of default is out there, but it is considered, for all intents and purposes, by large financial players, non-existent. But the last time we bumped up against the debt ceiling, the Congress, the President had an awful lot of trouble figuring out how to deal with it. Our stock market went into decline, and it created an enormous amount of uncertainty in this economy. And that brings me to my fourth point on reasons we might be pessimistic. Uncertainty about the future. We don't know how the debt ceiling is going to be resolved. Taxes may increase again. Government spending may dramatically decline from here. Some combination of the above if we're going to deal with a budget deficit. We've had budget deficits of over $1 trillion for 4 consecutive years now. All right. So there's uncertainty about the future. That has a negative impact on consumers. We have seen that show up already. But more importantly, it has a negative impact on businesses. Businesses are reluctant to invest in plant, equipment, and machinery. They are reluctant to hire new workers. And we've had CEOs of major corporations come out and say, hey, wait a minute, there's too much uncertainty here. I want that uncertainty to be settled. Are there going to be tax increases? Are there going to be spending cuts? I want to have that uncertainty settled before I make long-term decisions about investing in new plant, new equipment, new machinery to keep the American workforce productive. So with all that said, let me finish up my 10 minutes by simply saying, what do I think is likely to happen in 2013? I think we probably see a growing economy. I think we probably see something on the order of 2 to 3%. There you go. I rubbed my crystal ball as best I could, and I come up with one of these fungible numbers that economists sometimes do. But what I would caution you about is the following. What I expect to happen is I'll call it an uneven economic growth, an uneven financial markets. What do I mean by uneven? Or I'll call it, maybe if you're more mathematically inclined, you call it nonlinear. There's a tendency out there for people to say the following. Here's where we are today. Here's where we want to be a year from now. So I simply am going to, we're going to go from point A to point B with a straight line. All right? No bumps, no. And the answer is economies don't behave that way. Financial markets don't behave that way. They bump up, they bump down. You see good signals, you see bad signals. You see good data, you see bad data. Policymakers respond. It's think of it as being nonlinear or uneven. There'll be fits, there'll be starts, we'll stop, we'll start. Things will go well, they won't go well. But at the end of the day, when we look back on 2013, we'll see it was generally an average year in many ways, not robust economic growth that we need for job creation, but at the same time, I don't expect that we're dipping back into a recession. Okay? Thank you.
Awesome. This is a great example why Baldwin Wallace University is the place to be. You can learn a lot. Great students. This is absolutely outstanding. My background is in the business world, and I want to share with you a little bit about our insights about the Northeast Ohio economy. So, since this is a university, we have to not just lecture, but occasionally we ask questions. And so, my first thing I want to do is, this is a raise your hand kind of thing. I'm going to give you 3 choices. Think about the Northeast Ohio economy. So the big area of Northeast Ohio, all the way down to Canton and not the Mansfield, Youngstown, big area here. How many of you would say, and here's your 3 choices, that compared to, let's say, roughly 20 years ago, so in the early 1990s, over that 20-year period of time, is the economy in this area meaningfully lower, like down 10, 15%? Is it about the same, or is it about that same amount bigger? Is it 10, 15, 20% bigger? So how many people would say lower than it was about 20 years ago? Okay. How many people would say about flat with what it was? About even more, okay. And how many people would say actually it's meaningfully larger? Okay, well, not bad. Well, so that's probably a bit more people saying that, but maybe not a majority. The fact is that we are more like 15 to 20% bigger. And I would, as I give you my remarks, I would guess that this being a pretty learned group here, you're already probably pretty well informed, because that's why you're here. You want to learn more. You probably know a lot more about what these 2 gentlemen said than what I'm going to tell you. Because you access media that tell you a lot about the U.S. economy and a lot of the trends and the big issues and, my gosh, all the crazy things going on in the world that Michael's talking about. At least you've heard about those things. But where do you go to find out what is happening closer to home, about the economy here. Can't think of many places that actually do that and put it in perspective. It's one of the things that we do at Team NEO, because one of the main things we do is attract new companies here, or attract their business investment here, and they want to know, well, what's the economy like there? And so we looked around and said, how do we tell them? And we found there wasn't anybody to go to that knew. And so we had to start creating it ourselves. At each of your places, you have a little brochure like this. Every quarter, we do an economic review of the region. And if you flip it open all the way, you see a set of charts. And every quarter, we update those charts. It's basically kind of a heartbeat, kind of a dashboard about what's going on in the economy. And then we have some features that we put in here when you first open it up, that's the features section. When you open it all the way up, that's the dashboard section. So I wanted to start off with talking about the near term. I mean, we're divided here by geographies of global and national and local, but this issue of time frame is also very different. And the trends that are involved are really very different. But let's start with the near term. And you can look at some of these same points in our quarterly report. We're about to come out with another one in about 10 days, but this is still pretty accurate. So at a macro level, I ask you that question about the size of the economy. So we can get estimates, and of course all this stuff is estimates, of what the gross regional product is of Northeast Ohio. And it's same thing as gross domestic product, but it's just for the way we define Northeast Ohio. And we're following a lot of the patterns of the U.S. And that is that, we're getting better, but we're getting better at a pretty slow rate. The best estimate for this year, it's out there from Moody's, is that our region grew about 0.5% this year. And that followed 0.7% growth in 2011 and about 3% growth in 2010. Now, in 2008 and 9, when the economy was declining, in the aggregate, the GRP in this region went down about 9%. So you can see that we've done some recovering, but boy, we are crawling. And you would expect to see, a much better rate. Obviously during this year, even as we went along during the year, the pace of the economy slowed. Anecdotally, many of you are out there running businesses, particularly manufacturers. You probably felt like the second half of the year was slower than the first half of the year. I sure heard that a lot. And it's showing up to some extent in the statistics that came out today for the national economy. On the job front, we had a string of 9 consecutive quarters of year-over-year employment gains going through the third quarter. But the numbers we're now gathering for our next report, out in 10 days, says that in the fourth quarter, we actually went backwards. We actually had a small decrease in the number of people working in Northeast Ohio. And you can see on one of the first charts there in the upper left, as you open it all the way up, that's the chart of the number of people working. For the year as a whole, it looks like we've averaged less than a 0.5% increase in the number of people working. Again, we've made some progress, but essentially flat in the number of people working. That's not surprising. You can consider the GRP didn't go up very much, so you're not going to get that many people more working. We are still today running about 4 to 5% less people working, actual jobs, in Northeast Ohio than before the recession. So we're still down 4 to 5% in the total number of people working. Now, there's a couple things, though, that are very noteworthy, and I'm going to refer to one of the charts in there that admittedly is a little complicated. But in past recessions, and there's a chart in there that looks at how our economy has performed in recent recessions, we've seen, in most cases, the U.S. economy with positive job gains compared to before the recession. You know, we're 3 years past the bottom, and typically you would see the U.S. with significantly positive numbers. Even at the U.S. level, we're still running maybe around 3% down from where we were before the recession began. Now, as I mentioned, we're about 4 to 5% down, so we're a little bit worse. But if you can decipher the complicated chart we have in there, and I'll just tell you the punchline, today, you know, we're running about the same compared to the U.S. on that job count, which is not very good. But in most, you know, a number of prior recessions, by now the U.S. had gone up a lot and we were barely recovering. So we'd be performing a lot worse than the U.S. Neither the U.S. or Northeast Ohio are performing all that well at this point, but we're actually tracking more like the overall economy rather than lagging a lot. That's a real difference. You know, we have this self-perception, and the data shows to some of it, this is one of those perceptions that has a little bit of truth, that when the U.S. economy gets a cold, we get pneumonia, you know, you've heard that kind of stuff. That didn't happen this time. You know, we both have whooping cough or something. I mean, it's not good on either front, but we're about the same. That's really interesting. And we've tried to do some work to understand it, and we're not necessarily experts at this, but I think we believe it has a lot to do with the diversification of the economy that's taken place, again, over the last, you know, steadily, you know, over the last number of decades. You know, in the Q&A, we can talk a lot more about that. I'll comment a little bit more about long-term trends, but hopefully you've got some good questions about that. Now, let's look at the unemployment rate area. I actually prefer to talk about actual people working, because the unemployment rate is made up of this funny thing that tries to estimate the number of people looking for work and then says how many of them have a job. And as we all have heard a lot of stuff about people stopping looking for work, that's the worst way to get your unemployment rate down, is that the percentage gets better because people quit looking. And so the people working are a bigger percentage of a smaller base. At the U.S. level, you can explain most of the improvement in the unemployment rate by people quitting working. That's something that isn't talked a lot about. It's talked about, but not all that much. In Northeast Ohio, we've had a little bit of that phenomenon, but it actually looks like this last year, our labor participation rate actually kind of really rebounded. So if you look at during the recession, our labor participation rate is relatively flat. And we're sitting here today at about a 6.5% unemployment rate in Northeast Ohio, and the U.S. rate, as you've heard, is about a full percentage point higher than that. And the U.S. rate has had the benefit of people dropping out of the workforce. Now, what's also interesting about that unemployment rate is that going into the recession, we were running about a point and a half worse than the U.S. U.S. was going along at 4.5 or not even below 5, and we were at 5.5, 6. So we went into the recession with a higher unemployment rate. We're coming out of the recession with a lower unemployment rate, and our labor participation rate is higher than the U.S. number. So there's interesting pattern going on in there. One of the reasons, frankly, we outperform on that is that the U.S. population is growing faster than ours, and so the U.S. has to generate jobs at a faster rate than we do in Northeast Ohio in order to get that job rate down. So it's part of what's going on is really population dynamics. But nevertheless, we're sitting here today at about a 6.5% unemployment rate, which is better than the U.S. rate. Another indicator that you see in the report about the economy is we try to track what's going on in the real estate market, the business real estate market, both in the commercial area as well as industrial property. And in both cases, we've seen some increase in vacancy rates during the recession, but not all that much. And with industrial vacancy rates around 9%, that's as good and maybe some better than a lot of parts of the country. So we may have this self-image because we carry this cloud around that somehow the economy here is not any good, and especially in the industrial area. But we have an industrial vacancy rate that's on the lower side. And right now, companies are having a hard time finding some bigger buildings that they'd like to have. A couple other indicators that are more anecdotal, I guess, than which you can get time series data on is, and this has been in the news recently, you've seen the reports of the large amount of capital that's been raised by our local biomedical community and also by our entrepreneur community. And these are contrary to national trends. Venture capital fund investing around the country continues to be down, where in Northeast Ohio it's up. And those numbers for capital being raised by entrepreneurial ventures in Northeast Ohio make us one of the strongest areas for venture capital investments once you get off the coast. You know, Boston area is still very high. You know, the California coastal towns are still very high. But when you get in the middle of the United States, there's more venture capital going into companies in Northeast Ohio than there is in Chicago. And the Chicago economy is probably 4 times our size, 3 or 4 times our size. There's more venture capital being invested here. That's a very important indicator. We also track the amount of money being spent on big or larger private sector projects of one kind or another, corporate headquarters, just other buildings, even crazy things like casinos. We now, over a period of about 3 or 4 years, this is kind of around us now, we have $12 billion on our list of projects. The people we try to talk to who've been around and watched this stuff for a long time cannot think of a time in our history where we've had more private investment in major facilities, major activities than what we're seeing right now. Nothing like it. And that's saying something about the character of the economy. We carry around this image that we keep losing our corporate headquarters. But the fact is, in the last couple of years and right now, we have major new corporate headquarters being recommitted by Eaton, American Greetings, Goodyear. Diebold announced one. They're not going to do it, but they announced it and they're staying. And all of these people looked at going someplace else, but said, no, we can run a global enterprise from Northeast Ohio, so we're going to invest here. Bridgestone Firestone, that moved its corporate headquarters to Tennessee, decided to redevelop its technology center in Akron rather than move it closer to the corporate headquarters in Tennessee for a reason of the knowledge base and the technical base that are here. Even in our own place, Team Neo, with our job being to attract new business investment here. This last year, we attracted more new company investment than ever before. 15 companies in this last year who could have said, I'll put that investment in Indianapolis or Louisville or Kansas City or whatever, said, no, we're going to do it in Northeast Ohio. It's over 1,000 jobs. And that's more than we've ever had in our history. So a lot of this is hard to track in data, but when you see those things going on, it's the story of an economy and a region that's fighting back against some of the big longer-term trends that we've been struggling with for the last 30 or 40 years, frankly. And those things augur well for the future. So a couple points about future. We use a service called moodyseconomy.com that these gentlemen know very well, because it's one of the few sources that we can use to get local data like this. Their projection for our economy is that we will be, by the end of the decade, we'll be 17 or 18% bigger than today. That would be tremendously welcome because during the decade of the 2000s, we went sort of nowhere. We went up a little bit, and we started off by going down, and then we went up a little bit, and then we did down a lot at the end, and we didn't make any progress in that decade. We all hope Moody's is right. Their projection for the U.S. is about plus 23%. That 6% difference, which we'd like not to have, relative to our history would be tremendously good news. Because we've been lagging the U.S. economy and our economy here by a lot more than, 0.5% a year for the last 30 years. So if we're performing that much better, and it shows up in the manufacturing numbers, Moody's projection for the output by manufacturing in Northeast Ohio is that over the rest of this decade, it will grow faster than the U.S. manufacturing base. That has probably not happened since the 1950s. And it says something about how the manufacturing base has retooled itself. It has become decidedly more international, more global, more innovative, and more competitive. And Moody's is projecting, based on their computer models, that our base will grow actually faster than the U.S. manufacturing base, and that's part of their overall input on the economy. So, but the final thing I'll say, though, is there's an interesting dilemma. And that is, I commented about our unemployment rate, our workforce participation rate. We're down to 6.5%. Our participation rate is actually 3 or 4 percentage points higher than the U.S. average. So if we want to get more people into the workforce, we probably can't do it by getting more people, higher participation rate. At 6.5%, we're probably, guys, you know it better than me, 1.5% at most on what we can take it down? Are we going to be able to get really even down to 5? That's tough these days because skill levels are going up. It's hard to, so let's even say we can get down to 5. So that's 1.5 percentage points from where we are today. The economy has 2 million jobs in it. So you got 1.5 percentage points on 2 million, so maybe 30,000 people you can draw out of that workforce. Moody's projection, if we're going to grow 17% by the end of the decade, says we're going to have 150,000 jobs more needed in order to achieve that growth. So you know what we have right now, folks? What we're facing? We're facing a shortage of people who can do the work that we're projected to need. We now have a skilled people shortage. That is actually going to be the determinant of the growth of this region, is the number of skilled people. This is not unique to Northeast Ohio. You find these kinds of issues in a lot of other places. But it is so different than the way we think. We think it's all about getting more jobs. And I'm glad the presidential election is over for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is we can stop just shouting about jobs and start shouting about the need to get more skilled people out there. And for our region, attract more people to this region. Because we're going to need to get our population growing again, and if we're going to grow at the rate we are. So that's the story on the local scene, and I bet a lot of that you did not know. Because it is hard to find that information and have a perspective other than just little snapshots you happen to see in the paper every day. So I know the whole panel is looking forward to grilling from Harvey and all of you, so have at us.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
In the interest of brevity, let's move straight into the Q&A period. Procedurally, 2 things I would ask you to be mindful of. First of all, Scott has a microphone, and so if you have a question, raise your hand. He'll bring you the microphone. Second of all, if you would direct your question at one of the speakers by name. Yes, let's start with the young lady here.
Hi, thank you. Tanisha Rush, Community Development Specialist. This is dedicated towards Michael. Michael, you talked earlier about the youth opportunities and employment opportunities being very scarce in Europe. On the opposite side, are there certain areas where you do see an influx? Like Tom talked about here, the biomedical area. Are there certain areas that you see the youth potential in terms of job and opportunities?
In Europe, you mean?
Yes.
Well, for example, we talked about job shortages in Germany, which is a country which has probably the best performing economy in Europe, at least among the larger economies. there's major shortages of engineers and skilled workers. And why is that? One, the youth population, the working age population is in decline. And two, no potential immigrants in the engineering or science field speak German. So they have a major problem. German companies have a desperate need, and that's also the case in some Scandinavian countries, countries that are exporting outside of the Eurozone, where their economies are being propped up by these exports outside of Europe, are having serious issues with labor shortages in certain areas of the economy, and that's because the people simply don't speak the language of the business, and Germany being a very notable example of that.
Gentleman down front in the red here.
Thanks. My question's for Tom. Just what does Team NEO, like what kind of strategies do you guys have to entice businesses to come to this region?
You know, I'm obviously somewhat biased on this subject, but there is almost no industry out there that we don't have at least a decent argument for, and there's many that we have an excellent argument for. And you take the biomedical area, for example. We don't go after pharmaceutical companies so much, but we go after medical device companies. Why? Because we make stuff. So we've got a great biomedical research base, and we have a workforce and an infrastructure that knows how to make things. So the first thing you do is sell the business connections. But there are some truths that go on forever. There's probably enough people here who are old enough to have remembered the famous phrase, best location. Still holds in there, best location in the nation. And the number one thing that we sell, and you won't be able to see my little card that I carry around, but it lists the things that we sell on. And the number one thing on the list is quick, low-cost access to the heart of the North American economy. And it's still true that we're about 1 day away from half of the economy of North America, from right here. And when we talk to somebody in Europe, as an example, there's still more Europeans investing here than anyplace else. The simple message is, we're halfway between New York and Chicago, and the cost of living here is about 25% less. And they say, how do I get there? And I mean, it's just obvious. It just makes sense. So access to customers, low cost base, a pretty good workforce, pretty talented workforce, and we want it better, but still pretty good. And that's basically the formula. And then you get into individual idiosyncratic things to individual companies, that they have interest in, some funny kind of building they need or something like that. So, but those really start. You got to be close to the customers, and you got to have people and a good cost structure.
Other questions? Yes.
I have two questions, one to Michael and one to Kevin. Michael, you mentioned this earlier that if you look at the history of the world, in order to dominate the world, you had to have a strong economy, strong currency, and a strong army. You mentioned that China is obviously there. What's different, because a lot of people lull you into sleep thinking that, well, they're going to be the biggest economy, they just won't be the best economy. So what's your take on that? Because as I mentioned before, we're getting beat with our own playbook in the last 25 years. India, China, et cetera, they're not stupid. They came here, they see how it worked, go back home, figure it out. So what's your take on that? And my other question is for Kevin, which is, do you think the best we're going to do is stagnate or slow down the $16.5 trillion at best? Because are we capable in Washington of doing anything other than just stopping the bleeding but still have a major hole in our side of our body?
I get that there's some interest in this question, and I get the hard one.
Well, the reason I ask you, and Michael, that question is, obviously the media's direction is a little more left than right, and you get frustrated by the lack of feeling good, like you said about Cleveland. Everybody, it's a perception. But when a lot of your population is now on the gravy train, there's a tipping point, and all those things are kind of related. But so if you wouldn't mind answering those questions.
All right. Well, I'll start about China. In many ways, China is on its way to becoming a leading power. We consider 6 categories of power. There's military power. China's number 2. It's expanding its defense spending 10% a year. Political power, it's becoming a major player. It is a major player in East Asia. Economic power, it's the 2nd largest economy in the world, growing between 8 and 9%. It is much poorer than the United States and will remain so. Demographic power has 1.3 billion people. Cultural power, it's becoming more important. And I'm forgetting technological power, okay, it's also doing well. There are some challenges facing China, and there's a couple I'll bring up. One is a demographic challenge. It has 1.3 million people, but it is a relatively poor country that is shrinking in terms of population, in terms of working age population, beginning from this year. And what we've seen historically is that countries, as they developed economically and in terms of wealth, their populations grew, the workforce expanded, the domestic market expanded, and only when they achieved a certain level of wealth did they begin to see this demographic decline that you see in Europe, that you see in Japan. Though China, with the one-child policy, with an overall birth rate that's relatively low, 1.4 babies per woman at the moment, is going to have a shrinking working age population before the country gets rich. And this is going to place great strains on how does the country take care of the old people as the population ages in that country. It's going to be a major hindrance to Chinese development over the longer term. Another challenge is that China is struggling to find allies in the region. China is surrounded by countries which are either hostile to it or concerned about it. This will play a major role as well. So do I see China becoming a superpower? Absolutely. China has much more power potential than the Soviet Union ever had. It will be our greatest rival in the 21st century. It can also be our greatest market, our greatest partner. Depends on how history progresses, how the future progresses, excuse me. But certainly China has much power, has some challenges to deal with, but is here to stay in terms of a rival and as an economic rival for the United States.
And you wanted to talk about the debt limit and I feel like I'm on Dick Fagler's show all over again. This is an enormously difficult.
Back in the day when I was a boy.
That's a Dick
you,
Fagler line. There, thank you, Dick. I feel better now.
You're still in power.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we went to Euclid Beach and rode around, you know, stuff.
This is that for any administration, any Treasury Department. This is an the deficit and the debt limit. It is an enormously difficult issue. You know that, Bill. And here's why. Here's why. What's going on is politics. The political system has become so fractured in this country that no matter how much trouble we seem to be in with regard to the deficit or the debt limit, we seem unable to solve it, and so the solution is simply to let's do the minimum that we can so the financial markets view us as credible, so that the rating agencies don't downgrade us or downgrade us much, but let's push off as much of it as we can. And then when we actually do something, a lot of it is, well, we'll make cuts to defense spending, to social programs, and those cuts will take effect in the year 20 and fill in the blank somewhere down the road. So a lot of it's smoke, a lot of it's mirrors, a lot of it's cosmetic. Now, here's what people need to understand. If you can get the U.S. economy to grow quickly enough, much of the budget deficit problem we see going on right now will be gone. Not all of it, much of it, okay? And a simple example, when we ran through the 1990s, we got unemployment rates down 4.5%, at times even below 4% in this economy, and we generated a budget surplus. And lo and behold, we were sitting there over at the Treasury Department in the early 2000s and agree with him or disagree with him, what President Bush wanted to do was he believed that money belonged to the American public. And he wanted to give it back because we were running surpluses. Now, a whole lot of things happened after that. But the viewpoint inside Treasury was that money belongs to the American public and we should give it back to them. So if you can grow the economy that fast, but there's nothing out there right now to indicate that we're going to have the kind of robust economic growth for a decade that we had during the 1990s. So realistically, we're not looking at a budget surplus. But here's why a lot of it becomes problematic. 2 reasons. One, at some point in time, interest rates are going to rise. And it is entirely possible they may rise dramatically. At the Treasury Department, what we did in the early 2000s is when we saw interest rates rising, we were shifting how we would borrow money from short-term to long-term or long-term to short-term so that we could do the best job we could in saving money. But when those interest rates rise, some of what the Treasury Department goes out there and sells an enormous amount of what are called 3-month T-bills. Well, when interest rates rise, the interest cost to the United States government is going to rise, and that's simply going to make the deficit worse. It's going to add on to the American taxpayer bill, and roughly 8% of spending done by the federal government right now is simply to pay interest on money we've already borrowed. And the second and third largest holders of Treasury debt, the largest is the Federal Reserve. The second and third largest holders of Treasury debt, China and Japan. They hold roughly $2 trillion of Treasury debt, okay? So there's an enormous cost that's going to occur when interest rates rise. The other difficulty you run into, at some point in time, we will have another business cycle. We will go into another recession. Deficits normally increase during recessions. And so if we don't make the hard choices now, if we don't make those kind of choices now, then we're simply going to bump up against yet more deficit problems. It's going to be worse the next time we hit a recession because that deficit's going to grow. So this is, we've kicked this can down the road, and now it's just more obvious, and it's more politically fractured, and it's just absolutely amazing. But one way or the other, this is one of the major issues that has to be solved, and solved quickly. But it's going to require both a short-term solution, we have a debt limit coming, and it's going to require a long-term, a credible, real long-term solution that's something other than kicking the can and smoke and mirrors.
Harvey, while we're on this, could we ask Michael to comment about any lessons, if there are any, from Europe on this, where you have some countries that have been facing this, and it just seems like a natural combination.
And I would like to hear that, but in the meantime,
yes,
or while he's speaking, I want you to think about, I would like for you to address or speak to union activity here in Northeast Ohio and how that impacts our ability to attract business. Does it make us competitive or less attractive?
You just brought up one of Europe's problems.
Could you give me a bodyguard while we're doing this, Harvey? Thanks, Mark.
Please.
Yeah, well, certainly in Europe, there's a couple of key factors here. All the focus has been on the debt crisis, but it is in fact becoming a growth crisis. Now, one factor is that Europe's demographics are so poor. It makes Northeast Ohio, many of the countries make Northeast Ohio look like a fast-growing region. Right. You look at some of the birth rates in Spain and Italy, they're dramatically low. So the working age population is shrinking. You have incredibly generous social welfare programs in these countries. In many countries, you can retire before the age of 60 or at 62 with receiving 3/4 or 4/5 of your final salary. This is standard practice across much of continental Europe, certainly. You receive 5 or 6 weeks of vacation per year in most of these countries. You can't be fired for almost any reason. If you have a state job, it's pretty much a state job for life. So you have a very rigid system. You have very high cost, and you have a very quickly shrinking tax-paying base. So the revenues coming in Europe have been shrinking for some time now. Just demographically, the number of taxpayers in Europe is shrinking. But the number of people receiving these fantastic pensions, living for much longer, is growing quite rapidly. So what do you have? You have a system that can't sustain itself. You have 2 or 3 generations and post-war generations in Europe who lived fantastically, who maybe worked 30, 35 years, had 30 to 35 productive years of their life, where they had about 30 to 35 plus years of living off of the state. And that system, that's come home to roost in these countries as growth has slowed, as the working age population continues to shrink. And now we have this dramatic increase in unemployment, which has further reduced government revenues in these countries. You had a system that just wasn't sustainable. And as the labor force was shrinking, labor costs were rising, export competitiveness weakened. You had less students, you had less working age people. They were getting paid ever higher amounts of money. The state was in increasing amounts of debt. These countries' export competitiveness collapsed. So the domestic market was shrinking. The exports, it was more difficult to export because they weren't as competitive as countries elsewhere in the world. And you have what you have today, which is a crisis which is not going to end overnight. The debt crisis may have eased. I mean, you still have Greece, you still have Cyprus. But the debt crisis, in the currency crisis in Europe will probably be resolved. But the growth crisis is real. In many areas of Europe, in my opinion, are headed for what is Japan-like 2 decades plus of stagnation. We've seen in Japan the last 20 years minimal economic growth. The domestic market is shrinking. Export competitors are rising. The same thing is going to happen in much of Europe. And a lot of the blame has to go on the systems that were put in place. I mean, when you have a demographic system like that, you need to boost your export competitiveness continuously. And when you have such expensive systems in place and you can't afford them, you're reducing your export competitiveness dramatically.
So let's hope it doesn't repeat. Okay, on the union side, I do get that question a lot, and it's one of the another perception issue that's out there. In the private sector, so in the business sector, the union participation rate in Northeast Ohio, I believe, is probably below 10% at this point, but let's just say it's around 10%. So, okay, so think about how low that is, 10%. Nationally, it's a few percentage points lower than that, but you're talking about, in absolute terms, small number differences. But when it comes to, and by the way, as you might imagine, that membership is heavily concentrated in older sort of legacy manufacturing companies. So it's pretty concentrated. I can't think of a company, we've attracted, in our 5 years or so doing this, 63 companies. Not one of them has had a union election, let alone being unionized. So if we can get a company to listen to us about, best location in the nation kind of stuff, if they'll listen, we can convince them that you don't need to worry about that. Treat your people right, you're not going to have a problem. But we have this issue called right to work. And now Michigan has passed the law, and they'll probably have some legal challenges to sustaining it. Indiana became a right-to-work state last year or the year before. And so now we have 2 big competitors. So if you want to be generally in this part of the country, you've got the choice of being in a couple states where you will have, even though our level of union activity is a lot lower, you have even less there. And so if you have a choice, why bother? And so we know, and it's the most frustrating thing that we have, we know that we don't even get in the running for things because people have another choice right nearby. And they just, you can talk all you want to them, and they say, I know, but I have even less of an issue there. I have less worry there, so why don't I just go there? So, we overcome that frequently, but it's an ongoing issue. But but I would say a lot for the labor base that's here, union base that's here, in the business sector. Private sector unions, whole different story. But in the business sector, because of competition, the unionization in the businesses we have here has gotten much more progressive, much more productive. One of our landmark businesses in the area is the Middle Steel Mill there in the flats. It is one of their top couple most productive steel mills in the world in tons per employee hour and so forth. And Middle Steel brings employees from all over the world to Cleveland, to that steel mill, to see how productive the operation is. So the Chevrolet put the crews in Lordstown. Those of you who have lived here for a long time, we've been through lots of labor things at Lordstown, right? They put the crews at Lordstown because of the productivity of the union workforce in Lordstown. So we have great examples of even where we have union shops here that have become very productive. So it isn't holding back our economy, but it is an issue when we're trying to attract new investment. And I wish we could, join the ranks like Michigan and Indiana have, and at some point we probably will, but it's a tough one politically.
Okay. We got started a little late. We'll take two last questions here. The gentleman there with the turquoise shirt.
Thank you. I want to commend you, gentlemen. You've done a very nice job. I'm a former stockbroker, and I own my own company. And one of the questions, short of Erskine Bowles not being here, I want to ask you, because since you were at the Treasury Department, two questions, actually. The first one is that the $1.5 trillion that was loaned through TARP to Nations Bank, now Bank of America, was repaid about a year and a half ago. I thought that was supposed to go to the Treasury Department, was diverted to the general fund. Why did that happen? That's my first question. Second question is, on September 15, 2008, between 11 and 11:30, somebody withdrew $550 billion from our banking system, which had a devastating blow to the United States economy and the world at large. Why has that never been investigated? Thank you.
Yeah, these. I get the easy ones. Yeah, once again. Okay, I need to
Go for it.
All right. Quite simply, these are particular situations, and what I left. Here's the beauty of what happened with me. I left the Treasury in 2005.
Nice.
Paulson came in 2006. The crisis started 2006, 2007. Now I'm looking really, really smart for leaving. There we go. Thank you, Baldwin Wallace. Yeah. These, you know what? There are a whole host of particular situations out there. In some of these situations, money is given to the government. One of the problems that does occur is there is money that has, and there's been a lot of talk about things like the TARP program, for example. Did TARP really make a profit? Because a lot of what you see in that government budget is smoke, it's mirrors, there's money being moved around. And so my guess is that's one of the particulars. One of the problems we have had in the post-crisis world is we've become so ingrained in our thinking, and let's get this economy back on track, let's get our financial system back on track, that one of the things we haven't done is we haven't really gone back and said, hey, wait a minute, there are things that need to be investigated here. We need to have a better understanding of what happened. My wife just said this to me last night. She said, it's amazing how much went on during the financial crisis, and yet we see very few bankers and financial people in jail. Okay? And so quite simply, again, these are particulars, but we've rushed so quickly to try to get the economy back that issues like these, that you raise, haven't been adequately addressed, and even when they're brought up, they're not fully addressed or flushed out. And so there are a whole lingering collection of questions, many of which are particular to the situation that's out there. Go ahead. Sure.
You mentioned about China being one of the largest debtors.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. And last I looked, the largest debtor of America is actually us. 28% of it.
The Federal Reserve, and that's why.
Well, the Social Security Trust is 28%, and 20%, as I recollect, was to the federal, state, and local pension funds for the employees from various forms of government. So the largest debtor is actually ourselves at approximately 48%.
Yeah. No. I said second and third. We are China and Japan are the second and third largest holders of U.S. Treasury debt. But you're absolutely right. The U.S. government is the largest holder because of all the different programs and where those Treasury securities are inside various programs. Yeah. Yes. I said. Did I not? Did I say second?
Yeah,
okay. All right.
Right. Okay. Last question, Dr. Pickler.
Thank you. I'd be interested, Michael, in your thoughts about the sustainability of the Eurozone given the lack of a political union in Europe.
Europe, it was very easy to create a trade zone as far as Europe was concerned. When we get to the political questions, it's far more difficult. We see now with Britain potentially leaving, there'll be a referendum should the Conservative Party win the next election. They could leave the European Union. Within the Eurozone, we're seeing now an accelerated pace of integration because of this crisis. We see a bank supervisor which has been put in place. We see a host of financial tax which have been adopted by 11 of the Eurozone member states, financial transactions tax, excuse me. So I think the pace of integration is going to accelerate. Now that could leave a few members aside. Britain may opt out, Greece may be forced out, Cyprus may be forced out. But you could end up with a core Eurozone which is much more integrated, which shares the euro, and is not quite a full political union, because I don't think you'll ever have that in Europe. I think when it comes to defense issues, countries like France are going to go it alone. On some other issues as well, you have a north-south divide, whether it be the more statist economic systems in Southern Europe or the more trade-oriented, less state-involved systems of Northern Europe. But what you will have is a more cohesive Eurozone, a core Eurozone, minus Greece, minus Cyprus, a European Union, perhaps without Britain. My fear is that if the weaklings were to leave the euro, the weak countries, the euro would appreciate dramatically. I mean, the euro is relatively undervalued and is being held back by the weaker countries of Southern Europe. If you had a German-dominated Northern European euro, it would be a far stronger currency, and this would have devastating effects, in my opinion, on the Eurozone. Why? Because I was talking about earlier, these developed economies that are aging quickly, they need to improve their export competitiveness continuously. And a dramatic rise in the value of the euro would have a huge impact on the export-oriented economies like Germany, like the Netherlands, like Belgium. So while they're moving towards a closer political and economic union, and they could be dropping off some of the weaker bodies over a period of time, they could be really heading for doom. This could really be a long-term problem that they're heading for, because they need a weaker euro. They need to improve their export competitiveness, and by becoming more cohesive and by potentially reducing some of the weak members, they're doing the opposite.
Okay. Yes.
Let me just ask Tom one quick question, because we have young people in this room. You know, the other thing you get miserable on a topic, just like you talked about Cleveland. Every young person I meet, there's wonderful, quality, top-notch young people who want to work. The media makes you believe that a lot of them think this socialism thing looks pretty good. Like a Europe, you know, work a little bit, get a government job, nobody can fire you, life's good. But I don't get the sense that the people I meet, and maybe it's because I'm a Disney World suburbanite, but the young people I know are top flight. In Northeast Ohio, are you seeing, is there enough great kids still out here? Are we just getting lulled to sleep by the media to say, they're all thinking the socialism thing looks great? How do you see it from this view?
I think I'm trying to think of if there's any kind of objective way of measuring that, Mark. I mean, we all have our anecdotes. I think the best indicator is the best one I can think of is the resurgence of entrepreneurship that's going on here. 10 years ago, that was not even on the screen. If you took entrepreneur magazines, some of the places that groups that try to follow this, we were so low we just weren't even ranked, and now we're one of the higher ranked regions in the country for entrepreneurship, and I think that tells you a spirit of a lot of young people out there who want to try to make something happen. And it's about as good an indicator as as I can see. I think another one may be that maybe some of the young people here are part of it. This region has we are down on ourselves a lot because we have so many political subdivisions and so forth. We've got an incredible array of young professional groups. I mean, there are 25 of them in Cleveland by itself. Young professional groups that have sprung up of people who want to do something. They want to, boost the city. That they're trying to find interesting things to do and create. And it is that kind of spirit and engagement, I think, is a terrific thing to see. So I think there are indicators out there, but I'm fundamentally a optimist about this stuff. And I think with the younger people, I mean, the people the baby boomers like myself and some of a lot of us here are the abused children of Northeast Ohio. We've had 30 or 40 years where we were at the peak when we came in the economy, and we've sort of, from a growth standpoint, and we stopped growing, and we've sort of stagnated for 40 years. Literally 40 years of stagnation economically. And we've lived through all that, and we think that's what this place is all about. And we forget that we were growing, we were the Silicon Valley of the United States in the 50, 60, 70 years before that. And so what I see a lot, which is terrific about the young people, is they didn't see all that last 30 or 40 years. What they, they're blessedly ignorant of all that because they didn't live through it. And what they see is University Circle, they see the entrepreneurship, they see the opportunities are here, and they look around at the rest of it and say, what's the matter with you people? There's a lot that can happen here. And the spirit that I see in them is very reassuring. And it is, so I think it's, I think it's there. I think we got the makings of really starting that next growth curve. Won't be as fast as what we had in the, previous first half of the 20th century. But, we're laying the foundation to get growing again here, and I think it's going to be terrific to see.
Okay. Regrettably, we've exhausted our time. And if you would join me in thanking these gentlemen for a very comprehensive discussion.